with this latest 4 square metre rule?
So the announcement from the Prime Minister today that he's looking for indoor places to only allow an occupancy of 1 person per 4 square metres will mean a substantial change the way in which the Australian hospitality scene operates. Clearly these restrictions relate to all workplaces, all public places, all buildings. It means a major change in the way in which we live our lives, but also in the way in which hospitality will work. For a venue that's 100 square metres in space that can be occupied by people, it means, including staff, only 25 people per that 100 square metres. And obviously it's different for every single premises and every single layout according to what type of hospitality venue they are. The changes are obviously critical in the context of the advice that's been put forward by Australia's peak medical officers. It's been approved by the National Cabinet, and the hotel and hospitality industry across Western Australia and the country will do everything it can to implement those changes as soon as possible.
How much is the hospitality industry just feeling the pinch of this?
Well, clearly at the moment, there are some sectors that are under a lot of stress and strain. Our medical profession are under a huge amount of stress and strain, but our Australian tourism and hospitality sector is facing the toughest times that it ever has. Even in war times, our bars were still able to be open and operate pretty much as normal. This is an unprecedented time for Australia and our industry, and we understand that there are many, many businesses that will be closed as a result of these changes, and we are already seeing thousands, if not tens of thousands, of jobs lost as a result. Hopefully we can see those jobs come back again when the industry recovers, and it will. It's just a question of time to know whether it's weeks or months for that to occur.
Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for the hospitality industry at this time? What can they do?
I think the key thing at this stage is for us to keep calm. There are ways in which businesses can reduce and scale down their operations and mitigate the potential threat to closure. There are ways in which we can reduce staff hours, rostering, ways in which we can look at standing down employees, but there is still a lot of ambiguity around that with respect to the Australian Industrial Relations Framework. And of course, we've been asking the Commonwealth to provide greater flexibility and clarity around that. Just as we've seen with Qantas standing down their staff with a view to rehiring them again once they can start operations again, we need similar procedures to operate in the hospitality industry. But at this stage, we don't yet have the clarity around that in order to enact the stand-down provisions of the Fair Work Act. And that's a critical problem that we're currently facing with a lot of businesses that have got a huge amount of confusion about what they can do. Now, some businesses are choosing just to shut the doors and to cease operations because it's become impossible for them, and they can enact those stand-down provisions. Others are trying to maintain a minimum workforce. But either way, the fabric and nature of Australia's tourism industry has been severely impacted and damaged. We have no international tourists coming to the country. Domestic tourism interstate has trickled down to a very small number, and even people going out and about in our own areas is very small as well. I think one of the other key factors in all of this, if we are going to keep our hospitality venues open, our bars open, our restaurants open, it's going to rely on the public to maintain that distancing. The public are the ones who are able to provide that 1 in 4 square metre distancing, so effectively 1.5 metres between each person. And it means we've all got to cooperate, because if we don't do that, the next step will be that we may see a mandated shutdown if the public don't cooperate with that. It will be out of our hands as an industry to police it if the public doesn't cooperate and do that on their own initiative. It's about self-responsibility now.
Do you have any statistics on the number of businesses that have had to close down so far? Or?
At this point in time, the numbers are changing all the time, and so I really can't give stats on it, because you're talking about a state with thousands of hospitality businesses, and we're talking about hundreds that have already shut the doors already. So in terms of staff, and venues. It's changing by the hour, and of course today many venues will look at this new requirement, the 1 in 4 square metre requirement, and work out whether they can continue to run their business with those parameters. I think it's important that the industry understands that these decisions that are made by the Commonwealth Government, by state governments, are necessary, and that we don't have an option. We've got to do what we can to protect public health, to protect the safety of our staff and patrons, and that we have to comply with these changes moving forward. But in order to keep our hospitality industry open and for people to still be able to go out for a meal or for a drink, we've got to exercise self-discipline around that 1 in 4 square metres and keep our distance between ourselves.
You think people will still want to go out if they go to the bar with their mates and they're going to be that far apart?
It's going to be challenging. We're not used to being that far apart. I mean, even right now we're practicing this social distancing. It seems unusual, and it's going to be a different way. And we don't know how long this is going to last for. We don't know whether this is for weeks or months or longer. And so we're going to have to get used to this different style of engaging. I think the other important thing is it's not just about pubs and bars and restaurants, it's about gatherings of any sort. If someone's having a backyard party for a birthday party, they've also got to institute these distancing measures as well. So outdoor areas are allowed still if it's up to 500 people, but what must be implemented, whether it's a private home or a beer garden, is the 1 in 4 square metre rule. So if your backyard's 100 square metres, that's no more than 25 people. This applies across the board, and it's there are very few exemptions here.
In terms of, sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of the stand down staff rulings, where are you hoping to get the information from that, and what will it enable businesses to do?
So the Fair Work Act is very prescriptive around the ability to stand down a workforce. And where the ambiguity sits at the moment is that if an entire business is shut down, it's very clear they can't operate, therefore stand down provisions come into play. If 90% of the business is shut down or 50% of the business shut down, the Fair Work Act is ambiguous about whether stand down provisions can be used for those staff that are no longer required. And that's the difficulty at the moment for our industry.
And you've obviously put those questions to the
Yes, those issues have been raised with the Commonwealth Government, by ourselves, by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and others. The Attorney-General, Minister for Workplace Relations, Christian Porter, is very well aware of them. I think that they are working as best they can. The Fair Work Act is legislation, it is the law at the moment. And so the question will be, is the interpretation of that flexible? To what degree is it black and white? Is the Fair Work Commission able to provide some direction about that issue? Because there are many, many small and medium-sized businesses across the country that need to be able to effectively put staff on hold to protect their jobs in the long term, but be able to stand them down in the short term with the provisions that are there, but the trigger is still not understood.
Is this about as far as you can go without just completely locking down and locking out businesses? It sounds like it's going to be pretty far-reaching as it is, but can they really go any further? And can the business deal with that?
Without going to prescribed numbers of say no more than 10 or 20 in a venue, or as they've done in some jurisdictions, we're very close to what you would call a viable management system of people in hospitality venues. The restrictions, of course, don't apply in accommodation spaces where people are staying in rooms, but they do apply to the food and beverage areas and the gathering areas. There'll come a point for every business, and it's going to be different according to whether they're a small bar, a large suburban pub or tavern, or a restaurant. At what is the tipping point that they can't open because there's no longer a viability with the lower numbers. So there'll come to a point where the curve will either allow us to continue operating and increase the numbers, or the curve of the spread of the virus will force a potential closure across the board.
How are you seeing businesses adapt to this new way of operating? I've seen bars that, fine dining type areas that have suddenly gone to cutting off all the casuals and selling takeaway burgers. What are you seeing out there?
I've been in this industry and been in this organisation for 28 years. I've never seen anything like this. In the history of hospitality in our country, we've never seen anything like this, and throughout the world, everyone is in the same boat. We are all going through massive, enormous change in hospitality, where businesses that were focused on on-premise dining and drinking are now looking at focusing on takeaway and home delivery in order to stay alive. Businesses that have got high concentration of staff with long-term careers that have had to let people go or have had to change the structure of their business where they're not requiring as many staff. It's very sad, very upsetting to see across the board. The industry is trying to make the most and stay open as it can, but for a lot of businesses it is distressing. It is distressing for the owners and operators who've got valuable staff that they've had to reduce their time or their wages or their retention on, as it is for businesses across the country. And so I think we all need to not only be calm but be sensitive around this with each other and understand that managing this process is new ground that none of us have ever been on before, and we're learning how to do that as we go.
How this new measure, you sort of asked about what's happening in terms of closures at the moment, but how devastating do you think this will be, or what's the worst it could be just by this new measure?
Look, this distancing measure, if someone had raised it a month ago or 6 months ago, we would have said it was crazy and it would have destroyed businesses. And we know that it will impact a lot of businesses substantially, and they won't open because they just can't manage it. And for some, it'll mean they're just very much on the edge of being marginally viable. We've got to remember that hospitality industry works on the basis that if there's no customers, no revenue coming in, they can't pay suppliers, they can't pay rent and mortgage, they can't pay staff wages. Most hospitality businesses are small to medium-sized businesses. They don't have ultimate access to cash reserves, very different to large corporations, and there's not shareholders that can support them through reselling of equity and shares. So a very different set of models that exist within the small medium business sector. So, as government rolls out its announcements, we've also got to make sure that some of the benefits that we've seen today, like those capitalisation and interest repayment relief for small businesses, is extended into medium-sized businesses as well. It's got to be for small, medium-sized businesses across the board, and that's an issue that we still want clarity on.
How large is the casual workforce in hospitality and in the sectors you represent? And most of those, do you think most of those jobs now would probably be gone, if not
So in Western Australia, across the tourism industry, there's about 100,000 staff, of which there's over 50,000 that directly work in the hotel and hospitality sector. And of that 50,000 that work in the hotel and hospitality sector, around 70% are casual workforce. And that's because they're students, or they've got second and third jobs, or whatever the circumstances are, but it's as high as 70%. And obviously, that's a large number of people whose jobs and roles are very much on an edge. And it's a substantial number of people in Western Australia.
So it's probably about over 30,000 jobs, which, if not, people aren't getting shifts now, are probably going to be really struggling, would you say?
They're certainly at risk, and they've certainly seen shifts cut down. A lot of businesses where people might have been working 20 hours a week, where they've got dozens of casuals across the board, have had to reduce them down because the numbers are not there, the business is not there. So some people may be only getting a 4-hour shift. So this is going to start impacting on people's lives and how they're going to earn. And of course, we need a simple transition over to Commonwealth support in terms of Centrelink or any other income support mechanisms. And we've got to do it in a way that's simplistic, because those people and those staff are going to be very quickly needing some level of support.
Is there anything else the state or federal government can do in terms of loans, wage subsidies, anything that would help?
Look, there's a range of ideas that are out there at the moment that have been raised by the AHA, that have been raised by other industry organisations, that we're looking for the government to provide clarity and support within the commercial space, but also in terms of government policy and support as well. Some of those have been announced today by the government, particularly around the support in working with banks for small enterprises. There are issues there around medium-sized enterprises that we need to have addressed so that they've got relief from mortgage repayments and interest repayments. There's issues around potentially putting on hold the requirement for superannuation to be paid into a super fund, but instead to go into the wages and the pockets of staff in the short term to provide an extra 9.5% in their pocket in the short term. That's another one, but unfortunately that is again governed by legislation that specifically requires a certain law to be followed. And so some of these changes that we're looking for would require the Parliament to approve it. And that means the opposition approving it, and it means some of the independents not playing games and just being political, but working in the national interest.